Welcome to Between Two Psychs, a podcast where two psychologists and board-approved supervisors deep dive into many of the questions and challenges that provisional psychologists and early career therapists face in everyday practice, during training, throughout the internship, and beyond as they progress into working more independently. Your hosts, Isabelle Tombleson and Claire Trevitt, talk about a range of topics specifically relating to psychologists and therapists who are just starting out. Good morning.
Hi Claire, good morning.
Okay, so we're back again, and today we're going to talk about the ingredients of a good initial therapy session. So in a previous episode, we did differentiate between the initial intake and the initial session. And today we're going to be talking about the initial session. That is when the client initially comes into the therapy room. So it may not be the first time we've spoken to the client, but it'll be the first time that we've actually seen the client in the setting where therapy happens.
That's right. So the initial assessment is something that we're usually very focused on in the first session. We want to gather information, but there are some other really important elements to make sure we cover in the first session. And so today we will talk about establishing rapport, clarifying confidentiality, clarifying cancellations and any cancellation policy, if you have one, collect some history, of course, but also how we can weave in a little bit of therapy as well in that first session so that the client can walk away with a sense of how we do therapy so that they can walk away with something other than just having spoken about all of the things that have caused them pain in their life.
Yeah, and how we might wrap up the session so that the client can leave the room feeling ready to go back out into the world.
Great. Okay, let's start with those first moments of the session. How would you start, Claire, with that?
Yeah, I think the first moments are just so very important. So I like to make sure that I'm on time, and I like to go out and greet the client, make sure that they've got what they need. So we have water and those sorts of things, and just bringing them into the therapy room. And I take my time with that and just let them sit down and just get a little bit familiar with the space. So I don't sit there in silence, but I'll just take it very slowly.
Okay. And so this is a part of you creating that sense of like calmness and safety with your client.
It is, I think, just bearing in mind that they're coming into a brand new space and a space that they've never been in before and the space that we're very familiar with. So it's more that I just keep that in mind as they're coming into the room. And I usually then get into things quite, not quickly, but once we're sitting down, I'll get a sense of them. I'll look at them and get a sense.
You'll read them a bit.
Yeah, and that might determine the pace, because sometimes clients come in and they're on. And if that's the case, I'm like, we've started. But a lot of clients are not sure how to get started. And so I might look at them and I'll say, here we are. It's really good to meet you. And then I'll say, I usually have 2 questions for people. You don't have to answer these questions right now. You may not even have the answers to these questions right now, but the 2 things I'm really interested in are what brings you and what do you hope to get from coming. And I find that those 2 questions, they're very open questions, but I find that those 2 questions usually open things up a little bit. And so the client will then start giving me a sense of why they've come, which is really what I'm interested in, even though I've spoken to them on the phone. And I'll say, look, I know I've spoken to you on the phone, but these are the questions that, that I usually have for people. And I find that those 2 questions are really good icebreakers, and they're open enough and they're not like an interrogation. Tell me this, what's your name, what's your surname, how old are you? Because we have all this information we're trying to get through. But I think that we want to really establish that connection first.
And this is really nice as well, I think, because if we've got listeners who are early into their careers, getting accustomed to remembering all of the areas that we ideally want to collect information on and doing that in a way that also helps a client to feel safe and comfortable. Like that's a skill that we learn over time. I think back to when I was first starting, I would say to a client, look, I've got this initial form that helps guide me in collecting all of the information that's useful for me to have on you. I would also say it's okay if we don't follow it exactly, but if you don't mind, I am just going to be writing things down, maybe in different sections of this form as you just talk and tell me about you. And I think that was how I used to make it a little bit softer in those early times. And of course, as we get experience, we just end up memorizing most of the areas of an initial assessment that we like to gather.
We do, and I think most of us do start off with a form in front of us. And if we do, I think that's a lovely way to explain that, because I personally find the writing can be a bit of a barrier, but also in the way that I was trained not to take any notes at all in session, because the client might be wondering why you're writing one thing down and why you're not writing something else down. And I find that I start writing and then I get distracted by what the client's saying, and then I forget to write anyway. And the clipboard ends up down on the floor or on the table, and I may as well have not had it in the first place. But I'm not necessarily saying that needs to be the case for everybody, but it can get to that point.
I can so relate to that. Yeah. Absolutely. And I do have moments as well, even now, if I'm jotting something down, I'm like, I'm so aware that the client is actually watching me do this right now. There's something about what you've just said that's important enough that I must write it down. It's a funny thing to reflect on. Yeah.
I do sometimes write notes in I'm doing like EMDR and trying to get like cognitions, but I'll do that with the client. I'll say, so what was this? And they'll see me writing it down so that we've then got a record of that, because sometimes that language can be really important to come back to, but I'll set that up beforehand. But I think in the initial session, it is okay to have that form, but I would be explaining that to clients, but just knowing that you may not always need that. We do have, I think we can feel under pressure to complete that entire form, all of the information that we need, and to have everything down in session one. And sometimes that's possible. Sometimes people do a much longer initial session. They might do an hour and a half or a couple of hours. I think in a 50 to 60-minute session, having all of the information is pretty ambitious. And I would be concerned, particularly with the clients that I work with, because many of them have experienced trauma, and trust and safety are huge factors for many of the clients that I see. For me, I do want to focus more on establishing that connection. And I think if I can establish that connection and I forget something and I clarify it the next session, I think that's going to I think they're going to forgive that if they can see that I'm present.
There are pros and cons. As you're talking in my head, I'm remembering what the pros and cons are to being really focused and saying, look, I'm really sorry, but this is super important for me to get all this information today and maybe even part of the next time that I see you. But it's going to help me to ensure that I've got as full a picture as possible so that when I'm formulating your symptoms and your history and coming up with the treatment plan is most likely to be effective for you and help you to see like results. So that's the benefits of, I guess, approaching those initial sessions that way and being quite structured and, I guess, a bit rigid in how you do that. However, the cost to that, and if you have someone who you sense isn't on board with that process and isn't hooked in and understanding it like logically, they may be in a bit more of an emotion mind. There may be like experiencing some vulnerability, maybe there is some attachment or trauma history. If you choose to continue to be rigid in that process, you may not see that person again. So it's like you need to trust your clinician's intuition a little bit, trust your gut into whether or not this process is going to keep my client engaged with me.
Absolutely. And I think there are good ways to keep clients engaged and still fill out the form. But I think that we're just giving you different scenarios, and it's going to be different for different clients. If you are completing an assessment for example, you're completing an HD assessment, the chances are you're going to need to be writing that information down, but it's not a therapy, although it's a therapeutic service. An assessment, I think, differs from the intervention because you're not setting this relationship up for the long term. You're establish rapport in the moment and create an experience that's an affirming one, but not necessarily one that's going to be longer term. And so I think the expectations can be really quite different there.
That's a good point to bring up as well. Yeah. If you were doing assessments with someone, in my opinion, like you're wearing a completely different hat. You're a clinician conducting assessment, not conducting therapy. And I imagine like a consumer might be slightly more on board with that more rigid process in the beginning because of the nature of what they're there for. Yeah. So a big emphasis on flexibility, I guess, is where Claire and I are coming from. And it does come with experience. And hopefully we are helping to normalize. If you have that inkling to want to put the pen and paper aside, that's a good thing. And trust that.
Yeah. And you'll be surprised at how much you can remember.
Yes.
Over time, you begin to get a very good memory. What I have set up in my client management system, an intake form under my notes. I have various note templates, and one of them is an intake form. So I do have the sections that I want to complete in there. And so there'll be background, the presenting symptoms and the background information and any risk and social and education, substance use. So those key areas that we want to cover that would be across most intake forms. And so I do want that information, but I may not gather that in the first session. But what I do after the first session is I put as much information as I've got, and then I can see where the gaps are. And I can say, I didn't ask about this. I need maybe more information about early childhood. I need more information about the person's social support that they might have. And so then in my mind, I might go into the second session knowing that I want to address those gaps and wanting to weave those in.
I'm going to be really picky here and just point out that you use the term intake assessment. I think as you were describing that form and that process, and in my service, or I guess like where I've been working for the last 6 or 7 years, we've always called intake and initial assessment different things. So I just want to point out, if anyone is listening to us talk and we're using like those terms interchangeably, today Claire and I are talking about that initial assessment process. It could be an intake form or it could be an initial assessment form, but it's the first session.
Yes, thank you so much for pointing that out.
Sorry.
It is the first session. It's the first session notes. And I think this is where the intake and the initial assessment can sometimes be used interchangeably. And you're absolutely right. This is the initial session and I'm with the client. So it just goes to show that even though we're differentiating, the terms can still be used.
We still get them.
Yeah.
Yeah, we still interchange them. Totally.
Absolutely. Okay. So the other thing that I like to include in my initial session is a little bit of a taste of how I work. So it might just be my therapeutic style. So I might just be linking themes together and trying to give some little bit of psychoeducation or some sort of insight, or occasionally like an experiential exercise, particularly as I do a lot of somatic work, and sometimes I'll get clients that are looking for that. And so I'll say, would you like me to give you a sense of how this might look? And so I do try and weave in something so that they get a bit of a sense about how I would work experientially. Because I do think that even though the client's coming for the very first time, it is helpful for them to come away with something, even if you spend just 5 minutes and on providing something. And usually I would do that with consent. Like I would say, is this something that you would be interested in? Because some clients say, you know what, I just want to tell you everything. That's fine too. But I would offer that to the client.
That's lovely. Yeah, I think we can probably all relate to that. We all want to instill some hope and have our clients walking away feeling maybe also just a little bit better as well. If they were feeling quite anxious or nervous coming in or uncertain, walking away like feeling heard, feeling like they're in a safe space, like they found someone that they can be safe with and like they can trust and really be themselves with. And then, oh, so this person has some skills, this person has some ideas, and this is how it's going to help me to feel or be different. Love that.
Yeah, they may not come away feeling, they may well have just rehashed so many difficult aspects of their history. They may not come away feeling amazing, but we want them to come away with some sense of hope.
Absolutely. Yes. I remember that was like really emphasized when I was training. Like we want our clients to have at least some idea that things can and will be better.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing I think is really important, bearing in mind that sometimes clients are sharing quite a lot of information. Sometimes it may be for the very first time, but they're sharing often the more distressing and upsetting aspects of what's happening in their life. And so making sure that we take a little bit of time at the end just to see how they are. And if I'm getting up to the point where we've got maybe 10 minutes left, I will usually start to say, look, I'm aware of the time. And in a few moments, we're going to have to start wrapping up. So before we do that, I really just want to check in on you and just see how this has been for you because wow, there's a lot here and just get a sense of where they're at. You'd usually get a sense of whether a client is quite dysregulated, if a client's in very heightened distress, or they're very flat, and just really ensuring that we do what we need to do. And this may sometimes also be where we bring in a little bit of an intervention to making sure it may be some kind of grounding, or it may be just sitting and taking a breath or taking a moment to reflect on the session so that we leave them feeling ready back
Yeah.
into the world.
I'm so glad you mentioned that because it just even that in itself, like keeping to time in those initial appointments. Oh my gosh, I find that so hard. And clients will get on a roll and they can see that you're listening and that you're really taking everything in, and time can just evaporate before you know it. You're looking at and you're approaching the 60-minute mark and thinking how do I transition us now? So I think timekeeping is really valuable when we're in the early stages of our training, working out a way, like some verbal strategies to support our clients with that process, with approaching time, how we wrap up, and how we put our clients back together before they exit the room.
It is important, and also that we do need to try and finish on time. And I just think about the area that I work in, parking's a bit of a premium. And so I think if someone has parked in a 1 hour parking spot, they need to know that they can come and see me and then be back to their car within that time. And I think those things can be, I learned that quite early on in my career. I think, oh, I'm giving them an extra 5 minutes. It's not normally the case. Clients normally want to stick to time. They've got things to do. And we've often got other clients to see. So we really don't want to be running over a session if we can help it. And there is a lot to get through. So I think it's the not being rushed and taking the time, not feeling under pressure to get all of the information. And if there is a requirement to do that, or that's important to you, making sure that you do set up a longer session for that.
So being transparent about if we're going to be going over today, are you okay to go over? I think I've said that to clients on a number of occasions. Like, I'm noticing that you've still got a lot to say. I've got time to keep going if you've got time, but are you okay to keep going? So it's just that checking in, getting the consent. Is this all right? I've done that quite a few times in public service because clients aren't paying for our time and we're not often immediately back to back. There's usually a little bit of space in between appointments. Some days there's not, but usually I'll have space in between my appointments. So I'm like, I think it's worthwhile we go a little bit longer, but getting that consent first.
And making sure that it's specified that it's a one-off.
Oh, yeah.
And not a habit. So occasionally a client they've missed the bus and they arrive 5 minutes late. And sometimes I've said to a client, look, on this occasion, I can go 5 minutes over.
Mm.
Are you okay to do that? And most of the time they'll say, yes, please. But it's set up in advance so they know when the clock hits the hour that we've got another few minutes, and they're aware of that. So they know exactly how much time they've got. So I think that comes back to that setting up that, which we talked about in our episode on the initial intake, but setting up those expectations.
Yeah, and sticking to them as well.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Great discussion. Thank you, Claire.
Yes, and look, I feel like we've only scratched the surface here, but just giving you a sense of some of the ingredients for an initial session, and some things to think about, and to take a flexible approach to this.
Yeah, that's definitely the message today.
Yeah.
All right, we'll see you all next time.
See you later.
Thank you for tuning in today. If you enjoyed this episode, please take a moment to leave us a 5-star rating. It really helps others find the show. And don't forget to follow us on Instagram at Between Two Psychs for more updates and resources. For more information and to explore everything we offer, head over to our website, betweentwopsychs.com.au. We appreciate your support, and we'll see you next time.
With something other than just having spoken about all of the things that are... Woo! Cockroach. Other than talking about all the... Sorry. Oh my God.
That you get that.
That'll be a good blooper. So giving clients